Yirmiyahu was a prophet, was a good chaver of mine. Never understood a single word he said, but we helped him to drink his yain. And we always have some mighty fine yain. Singing simchat le'olam, kol ha'yeladim now. Simchat to the dagim in the deep blue sea. Simchat to you and me.
Welcome to the Haftarah Plethora video podcast, where we might not bring joy to the world, but we do talk about prophets like Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel. And sometimes we talk about prophets who don't even get their own books. And sometimes we talk about prophets who don't even get named.
Prophets who don't get their own books and who don't even get named? What the heck are you talking about?
Well, Rick, remember how last week I was talking about how sometimes the Haftarah is just a good story?
Yeah.
And this week's double Parsha of Haftarah M'tzora.
You mean Haftarah Plethora M'tzora? That's a triple play.
Indeed it is. But the Parsha is just filled with pretty disgusting stuff about biblical leprosy. So we especially need a good yarn to wake us up.
Well, I wouldn't call any of the Torah disgusting, but I definitely get your point. And this week's Haftarah sure is an interesting story.
But that's just the thing, Rick. This week's Haftarah is from the second book of Kings, and it's actually one of the 15 stories about Elisha the prophet, the successor to the more famous Elijah, neither one of whom got a book of their own. Furthermore, Elisha, about whom we read several months ago on Parshat Vayera, isn't even mentioned by name in the selection of verses that we read this week. But he is the character referred to as Ish HaElohim, or man of God, in verse 17.
Before you get too carried away, don't you want to introduce us?
Oh, of course. You know how inspired I get when talking about the Haftarah. I forget myself.
And me.
How could I forget you? You're Rick Muller, my good chaver and the king of cannellation, and I'm Larry Herman, sipping some fine Israeli wine on this, the eve of Yom HaAtzmaut. And together we're doing one of our favorite things, talking and chanting Haftarah.
Okay, now back to your point. Had this been a year when we would have read Tazria and M'tzora separately, separate weeks, the Haftarah for Tazria would have also come from the second book of Kings and would also have been about Elisha, but in that Haftarah, we actually hear his name.
Good point, Rick. Both the Haftarot for Tazria and M'tzora are Elisha stories, and both famously involve lepers, or Mitzoraim, which is what connects them to the Torah reading. But in truth, it's a pretty tenuous connection.
But a connection nonetheless.
Yes, it is. What I find very interesting is that this story, which I'll briefly describe in a moment, is not really told in its entirety in the 18 verses that we read. We pick it up in verse 3 of chapter 7, with the 4 lepers outside the gate of the city of Samaria. But in fact, the story begins back in chapter 6, verse 24. The king of Aram is besieging Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. There's a great famine taking place, so great that prices for even terrible food such as donkey heads and dove dung are soaring, and the people are resorting to cannibalism. The unnamed king of Israel blames Elisha and wants to kill him. But at the last moment, the king's messenger announces that the calamity is from God. Elisha takes that as a sign that within a day, things will be better and food prices will fall so that the people can afford to buy choice flour and barley. In verse 2 of chapter 7, that's the last verse before we pick up the story, an aide to the king mocks Elisha's prophecy. And Elisha foretells the man's ironic end with the words, "You are about to see it with your own eyes, but you shall not eat from it." By verse 17 of what we read, we see just how ironically humorous these words were.
So that puts the main action in our Haftarah in a completely different light. The lepers living outside the city are starving just like the people inside the city.
Yeah.
Their venturing out to the camp of the Arameans is an act of desperation.
Exactly. But as our story goes, they find the camp, the lepers find the camp abandoned and help themselves to food and booty. Only later that night, they consider informing their fellow countrymen holed up in the besieged city. This entire vignette is rather comical, at least read with the right voices, perhaps a la Monty Python.
You mean lines like Vayomru ish el re'ehu lo chen anachnu osim?
Exactly. And they said to one another, "We're not doing right. This day is a day of good tidings." Of course, we also have the skepticism of the king, who at first doesn't believe the reports. But eventually, the people ransack the abandoned camp for food, and prices collapse down to a shekel for 2 gallons of choice flour and 4 gallons of barley.
And in true Monty Python fashion, the king's aid is trampled by the people rushing out to the Aramaean camp, thus fulfilling Elisha's prophecy.
And that part is repeated in the final verses, ensuring that we understand the great power conferred on Elisha, but here only referred to as Isha Elohim.
A great and amusing story told with great flourish, at least in terms of the trope. It's filled with zarkaz and seguls, zakef gadols, dargat tavirs, there's 4 gershaims, and lots of your favorites, kadma v'azla.
Yep. And even a couple of munach lagarmes and 22 reviyaz. Not so rare, but still 22 and only 18 verses. So Rick, I suggest we divide the chanting into 3 parts. Let's start with the story of the lepers in verses 3 through 9. Then we'll do verses 10 through 16, which describe how the king and the city dwellers cautiously took advantage of the good news. And we'll conclude with the final 4 verses of the chapter that recount the ironic trampling of the king's aid and the repetition of Elisha's forecast of his doom.
Okay, so what I see in the first section, at the very beginning, the Dargat Tavir, Arba'a Anashim, it really grabs my attention. It's character driven, these 4 men. It's not about God talking to Elisha or anything cosmic like that. It's a story about 4 people. So
it's a story, right?
Yeah, so I would imagine it's kind of like Shakespeare. The curtain opens and you got 4 people looking at each other. And then through that first section, the Kadma V'Azlaz, they appear on the most important words of the action. Verse 4, we should go into town, is what it says, Navo Ha'ir. Well, they're deciding if we go into town, we're going to die there. The people will either kill us or we'll die of famine there. So they decide to go out. And then Melech Yisrael in verse 6, the king of Israel and the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Egypt. That's what the Aramaeans are saying to each other.
Interestingly, Rick, if I can just comment,
yes,
some of the commentary is that this story about the Egyptians and the Hittites was actually inserted because it is, what's it called when you change the time period?
Anachronistic.
It's an anachronistic reference.
Yeah.
So inserted as the explanation for why they maybe abandoned their camp.
Yeah, believe it. And then verse 8, Hamtzoraim Ha'ela, again has the dramatic trope, the Kadma V'Azla. They're the stars of the story. And I know it's in verse 9, but let me point it out. So when they say Yom Besorahi, it's a day of good tidings, I think the word Besorah was chosen very carefully because they're Mitzoraim, and here Yom Besorah, the day of good news. So even good news can come from lepers. They shouldn't be so outcast. I mean, after a while, they turn patriotic and they rescue the city. So that's
exactly.
It's not a trope thing there. It's just a word thing.
Right. It points out again the humor or the amusement of this entire story.
Yeah, because a M'tzora can bring Bisora.
So Rick, before you recite the bracha, I'll just tell everybody that the Haftarah is found on page 676 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash, and we're ready to chant the first part.
Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Ve'arba'a anashim hayu mitzoraim petach hasha'ar vayomru isha re'ehu ma anachnu yoshvim po admatnu imamarnu navo ha'ir Harav ba'ir v'matnu sham v'im yashavnu fo v'matnu ve'ata lechu v'nipla ha'machanei aram im yechayunu nichye v'im yemitunu v'matnu Vayakumu vaneshef lavo el machane aram vayavo'u ad k'tzei machane aram v'hine ein sham ish v'Adonai ishmiya et machane aram kol rechev kol sus kol Chayil gadol, vayomru, ish el achiv, hine sachar aleinu, melech Yisrael, et machei achitim, et machei mitzrayim, lavo aleinu, vayakumu, vayanusu, Vaneshef, Vayazvu, et Oholehem, Vetsusehem, Verchamorehem, Hamachane, Kasher Vayanusu, Al Nafsham, Vayavo'u, Hametzoraim Ha'ele, Ad Ketzei Machane, Vayavo'u el ohel echad, vayochlu vayishtu, vayisu misham, kesef v'zahav uvgadim, vayilchu vayatminu, vayashuvu, vayavo'u el ohel acher, Vayisu misham, vayilchu, vayatminu, vayomru, isharehu, lochen, anachnu osim. It's not right, lochen. Hayom hazeh, yom besorahu, vanachnu machshim. V'chikinu ad or haboker umtsa'anu avon ve'ata lechu v'navo'a v'nagida beit hamelech.
You know, Rick, you could probably drash just from that last verse 9 about the recognition by the lepers that, well, what we're doing isn't so good, isn't right.
Yes, yes. And the reason I brought it up is at the end, I got this from the commentary that the very last sentence, what happens to the aid is Cain is just like what Elisha said. So the Cain and the Cain reflect each other there. I got that from the commentary.
A contrast between the lowly lepers,
Yeah.
who eventually on their own figure to do what is good,
Yes.
and the highfalutin aid to the king,
Yes.
who doesn't.
Yeah.
So what do you see? What do you see?
The Cain is on top of 676. What do I see? What?
What do you see in the next set of verses? Verses 10 through 16.
Well, before we leave 9, I always thought when you say Boker Tov and somebody says Boker Or in the
Yes.
response, it's right there, Ad Or Ha Boker. So I just
Right.
thought that's interesting. Anyway, the next section, you have a Yativ there in verse 10, Banu. When they're reporting to the gatekeepers, we came to the Machane Aram, to the camp of the Arameans. So it's obviously a highlight of the story that they're telling what they saw. And then each piece, when it's a major movement of the story, verse 12, the king arose in the night when he heard about things. And verse 13, one of the courtiers speaks up and say, hey, let's take some of the remaining horses, the ones that haven't been eaten yet. Oh, and there's the 2 Zarkaz there. That's pretty rare in verse 13. Minasusim, Hanisharim, the horses that were remaining that hadn't been eaten yet. They
doesn't explicitly say that they haven't been eaten, but there's a hint there.
Yeah, the hint. And they ride those out to the camp to verify the story. And
but you know, in all of what you're talking about up through now,
yes,
there is a lack of belief, a lack of trust, a suspicion on the part of the gatekeeper, on the part of the king, on the part of they're not sure that the lepers are telling them the truth.
Yes.
Or they're not sure that the Arameans have actually left the camp.
Yeah.
They think that there may be a trick involved. So in fact, the king's aide, who's also suspicious when Elisha gives his prophecy, may simply be reflecting this degree of suspicion and lack of faith.
Yeah, it was a time of war also, so it's tough. It's tough to trust everybody, but things worked out.
All right. Anything else to report before you or to have us look at before you chant verses 10 through 16?
No, I'm okay.
All right, then take it away.
Vayavo'u, vayikra'u, el sho'er ha'ir, vayagidu lahem lemor, banu el machane aram, vehine ein sham, ish vekol adam, ki im hasus asur, והחמור אסור ואוהלים כאשר המה ויקרא השוערים ויגידו בית המלך פנימה ויקום המלך לילה ויאמר אל עבדיו אגידנה לכם et asher asu lanu aram yad'u ki revim anachnu vayetzu min hamachane lechavei vasadeh lemor ki yetzu min ha'ir v'nitpasem chayim ve'el ha'ir navo vaya'an echad me'avadav vayomer v'yichuna chamisha min hasusim hanisharim asher nisharu vah hinam kechol amon Yisrael asher nisharu vah hinam kechol amon Yisrael asher tamu v'nishlecha v'nir'eh vayikhu shnei rechev susim vayishlach hamelech acharei machane aram lemor lechu ur'u vayelchu acharehem ad hayarden, v'hinei kol haderech melea v'gadim v'chelim asher yishlichu aram v'chofzam vayashuvu hamalachim vayagidu lamelech vayetzeham vayavozu et machane aram vayisasolet b'shekel v'satayim sorim b'shekel kidvar Adonai.
So we end this part with the prices actually coming down, as we said.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and then so the next section, the king is the main subject there. Hivkid et hashalish. The king had put his trust in his shalish, in his aide, the one that he leaned on at the gate, and the poor guy gets trampled. Vayir Masuhu, right there, in the joy or the just the starving nature, the mob, whatever.
It's not clear whether the mob is leaving the city to go get the food, or whether they're trampling when they come back with the food. But regardless, he gets trampled by the masses.
Yeah, I think it'd be when they were going out. But anyway, so that's the highlight there. And then verse 19 has the last Zarkah, the rare trope, the man of God speaks, and he wraps up the story talking about God making the windows in the sky, so he could certainly bring some food to the city.
Right. Well, what he's doing is he's repeating what it was that the aide had said before we started this Haftarah way back, where the aide was saying he didn't believe that the prices would come down because can the God who makes these casements or windows in the sky actually have this power? So it's a retelling of the prophecy at the beginning before our reading.
Yeah.
Just to make sure that we understand the power of Elisha's prophecy.
Yes.
So you want to take us home, Rick?
Yep. V'hamelech hivkir et hashalish asher nishan al yado al hasha'ar vayirmasuhu ha'am basha'ar vayamot kasher diber ish Elohim asher diber beredet hamelech elav vayhi kidaber ish Elohim el hamelech lemor satayim sorim b'shekel usasolet b'shekel yeh ka'ed machar b'sha'ar shomron vaya'an hashalish et ish Elohim vayomar v'hinei Adonai oseh arubot b'shamayim hayiyeh kadavar hazeh vayomer hincha ro'eh beinecha umisham lo tochel vayhi lo kain vayirmasu oto ha'am basha'ar vayamot.
Fantastic. Great.
Thanks.
So
and let me throw in, I thought the idea with the end of a Haftarah is not to end on a sad note. And here we have one that ends in the death of the guy. So I don't know how that's a happy thing other than fulfilling the prophecy, but seems to be a sad note to me. Ask a rabbi about it. See what the rabbi says.
Not so sad. He was doubting the power. He was doubting the power of God.
Yeah.
That was the prophecy of Elisha.
He still gets killed. Okay.
All right. Well, I hope everyone had a happy Yom HaAtzmaut, which we're actually getting ready for right now. We want to thank our technical advisor and our Anurin expert, Norm Gar. Don't forget to write us with your thoughts and comments. Our emails are below. And we wish you all Shabbat Shalom and see you again next week.
Bye.